Okay, so welcome everyone, and thank you for joining our panel on Library Assessment Perspectives, which has been organized by the Carl Assessment Committee's Continuing Education Working Group. This is a first in a series of webinars to be hosted throughout the year in lieu of an in-person Canadian Library Assessment workshop in the fall of 2021. I'm Julie Morin, one of the program officers at Carl, and I'd like to commence by acknowledging that I am joining this webinar from the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation, here in Ottawa, where the Carl office is also located. I would also like to acknowledge that the panelists in the series are joining us from the traditional territories of many Indigenous peoples who continue to live and work in this land today, and I invite you to add your own land acknowledgements into the chat. I'd also like to take this opportunity to run through a few housekeeping items. Participants have been muted upon entry. You may use the chat feature to bring technical difficulties to our attention or to share comments and resources. Our presenters will also be taking questions at the end, so you're encouraged to type your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Questions can be asked in French or English and can be translated by Carl staff if necessary. Links to the Carl Code of Conduct in both English and French have been included at the beginning of the chat thread. The organizers of this webinar are committed to providing a welcoming, professionally engaging, and safe experience. If you have any questions or concerns, please contact Susan Haig, Carl Executive Director, whose email is also available via the chat. Finally, note that auto-generated captions have been enabled for this webinar, which is being recorded and will be made available after the session. Nos présentatrices répondront aux questions à la fin. Vous êtes donc encouragés à taper vos questions en utilisant la fonction questions et réponses au bas de votre écran. Les questions peuvent être posées en français ou en anglais et peuvent être traduites par le personnel de la BRC si nécessaire. Ce webinaire est en cours d'enregistrement et sera disponible après la session. Des liens vers le code de conduite de la BRC ont été inclus au début du fil de discussion. Si vous avez des questions ou des préoccupations à ce sujet, veuillez contacter Susan Haig, directrice générale de la BRC, dont le courriel est également disponible via le fil de discussion. Now I would like to introduce our moderator for this session. Mary Jo Romaniuk is the Vice Provost for Libraries and Cultural Resources at the University of Calgary and a full professor in the Museums and Cultural Studies program. She has a Bachelor's of Commerce, an MLIS from San Jose State, and a PhD from Queensland's University of Technology. She developed inaugural programs, courses for the University of Southern California MMLIS, where she also taught. She was a library journal mover and shaker and continues her executive role with Northern Exposure to Leadership. Most of her research has been in the areas of leadership and leadership development. She is particularly interested in the development of emerging leaders and leadership emergence and effectiveness. Mary Jo is also interested in evaluation research and has lectured on research planning, methodologies, quantitative methods in libraries, and mixed methods research. She is a member of the Carl Assessment Committee, chairs the Continuing Education Working Group, and is the secretary of the IFLA Statistics and Evaluation section.
Thanks, Julie. I would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7 in Southern Alberta, and the city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. I am really excited to share this. I'm the moderator today and have two fantastic panelists. Shailu Betty has worked in a leadership capacity with the University of Victoria Library since 2004. And as of 2017, she has dual reports between the libraries and the Learning, Teaching, Support and Innovation Division as Director for the Office of Student Academic Success. In these roles, and she leads initiatives which foster student engagement and success, coordinating the undergraduate student research awards, developing programming to support student academic writing and integrity, learning strategies program, and she serves as the managing editor for the university's undergraduate research journal. With the libraries, her role includes leading the library's instructional program, the Learning Commons, and facilities planning. For both divisions, Shailu leads assessment and evaluation initiatives. She completed her PhD in education, curriculum, and instruction. She is an adjunct assistant professor with the Educational Psychology and Leadership Studies Department at UVic, and she teaches graduate courses in the areas of diversity, anti-racism, leadership, and narrative inquiry. Shailu is passionate about research methods and has recently published a book with colleague Janaea Webb called Visual Research Methods, an introduction for library and information studies with Facet Publishing. Our second panelist, Lori Kloda, is the Associate University Librarian, Planning and Community Relations at Concordia University. Her portfolio includes oversight for planning, assessment, project management, and communications, as well as community projects. Prior to that, she was a health sciences librarian and then the assessment librarian at McGill University. Lori has a master's and PhD in information studies from McGill. Her interests include the information needs of health professionals, experts searching for systematic reviews, planning and assessment, and evidence-based practice. Her recent research includes an exploration of the value of journal club participation by academic librarians and an investigation of research output of Canadian Library and Information Studies faculty. She teaches workshops on planning and conducting research for librarians in Canada and the US, and currently teaches the course Research and Evaluation at the University of Ottawa School of Information Studies. She was an editor-in-chief of the open access journal, Evidence-Based Library and Information Practice from 2014 to 2020, and she's a current member of the CARL Continuing Education Working Group. Welcome, Shailu and Lori, and thank you for joining us. Now, just a bit of an introduction. I think the Continuing Education Working Group has thought a lot about a series of webinars this year, and to start out, we're thinking about that as higher education, and in particular, by default, academic libraries, are increasingly focused on, of course, budgets, resource allocation, and most of all, accountability, either willingly or by necessity. So we all want to know how we're doing, how can we improve, and how we can attain desired outcomes. This session is the first in the series that helps us more fully explain and explore these questions. It's a theoretical session with examples that translate the theory we talk about into practice and application. It's set up as a panel in an acknowledgement that we each take and interpret knowledge and theory to suit our own circumstances and work with this and work with our own approaches to assessment, evaluation, and research, all in different ways. Today starts with the high-level overview, and we're going to move quickly through some foundational concepts in assessment, evaluation, and research, emphasizing process and underlying principles, but focusing also on qualitative evaluation and research and how we might be more rigorous and perhaps more adventurous in our endeavors. We'll make the additional information available after the session, and we're going to go through 5 questions in the next half hour with about 20 minutes at the end for questions. With that, let's get started. Over to our panelists for the first question. We often use terms like assessment, evaluation, and research almost interchangeably and in libraries. We want to get a common understanding so we all are at the same place for our starting point. Do you see these as distinct processes, and how do you differentiate these potentially distinct concepts, but concepts which at times have overlapping processes and perhaps even concepts? So can you talk a bit about that? And then I'll come back and ask you a bit more about evaluation research, kind of a combination of some of the ideas. Who would like to start? Lori, you're ready to.
Oh, you've pinpointed me. Thanks, Mary Jo. I just want to begin by saying that I'm speaking to you from my home in Montreal, and I work at Concordia University, also in Montreal. And I want to begin by acknowledging that Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is recognized as custodians of the lands and waters on which I'm speaking today. And Jojega, Montreal is historically known as the gathering place for many First Nations. And today it's home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. And I'm really grateful to be able to talk to you today under these circumstances. But I'll try my best to be the first person to answer this question. So the distinction or the difference between research, evaluation, and assessment, is that right, Mary Jo?
Yeah.
So yeah, I'd say that I think there's, I know that everyone has maybe their own understanding of these terms, and sometimes some terms can be used a little bit interchangeably. But the way that I understand these concepts, it's evolved over time, and I'm sure it will continue to evolve. But the current way that I think about them is in relation to each other is that research is an activity that among other things, has as its goal to contribute to knowledge, knowledge that's useful and generalizable and adds to theory. And evaluation is an activity, like in general, like evaluation is about making a judgment, a value judgment. of something, its worth, its value, maybe its impact, seeing if something's good or bad or effective or useful. But usually when we're talking about evaluation in libraries or in academia, we're talking about evaluating a process or a program or an output. And so we're talking about a particular type of evaluation, not about necessarily assigning a numerical value like of money to a particular item, but rather to a program. And so usually it's an activity that also has a way of contributing to knowledge. It might just be on a slightly smaller scale. So I see evaluation as possibly being a type of research as well, or overlapping with research. And I also think, I'm just going to keep this short because I want Shailu to jump in, but assessment and evaluation I think are often used interchangeably. I don't think they're necessarily interchangeable, but I think that if we're being honest, in academic librarianship, we sometimes use the term assessment to mean evaluation, but in academic circles, I think assessment means something specific. It usually refers to pedagogical assessments. And so I think that's a specific type of evaluation. And so we have like formative and summative assessment, and instructional librarians will be all too familiar with those terms. And so I'll just put that out there. And, those words have specific meanings, but I think we use evaluation and assessment somewhat interchangeably. And when we talk about evaluation, we're really talking about a specific subset of research that is looking to systematically observe and collect data in order to make a value or judgment about whether something is effective or good or bad or something like that.
Great. Shailu, would you like to add to her?
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. It's really wonderful to be here for Carl. And I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm on the traditional territories of the Tsimshian and the Lekwungen peoples of Coast Salish territories. I have been an immigrant settler to these territories since 1973 when I came to these territories with my family from India. And I'm a very grateful visitor to be here. I also want to acknowledge that the historical relationships with these lands continue to today. And I want to thank the ancestors and the living of the first peoples for their stewardships of the land. So with respect to the question, I agree very much with what Laurie's comments are, and would just add that for me, it often comes back to what question it is that we're asking and the purpose and the intent that the question that we're investigating. So I think of assessment as a way which we can guide practice, or I think of research as a way that guides our theory development. And so it's really about what is the question and the intent that we're investigating that will help guide us to, are we using an assessment approach, a program evaluation approach, or research approach? So just to maybe add to the conversation, I think Laurie provided a really great, robust definitions and concepts around it, is to give an example. So in my own mind, I think about assessment. Of course, I think about exactly what Laurie just said around the critical pedagogical pieces for formative. So, these terms get used in different ways in our academic environments. But when I think of assessment, I think of a question, for example, what do our students think about our food policy if we were thinking about changing the policy, or wanted to know what would they like to see in that policy? I'm thinking assessment. But if I'm wanting to investigate how does allowing food in the library support student learning and experiences, then I'm starting to think about research. And the way I'm going to tackle those two questions will be different in how I approach it, because now I'm asking two different things. The second question is more research to me because the tools of assessment won't necessarily guide how I approach that and how I'm going to make sense of the data that I'm going to get. So just to elaborate on that, I think about assessment as helping these answer questions around the what, the who, how often, and much of our tools in assessment help us get that data. And it's really about gathering that analysis and data to provide evidence for that type of efficiency, for satisfaction, for perspective taking. In evaluation, and I actually have nothing to add because I think Lori did a wonderful job of explaining that. But coming back to maybe the empirical research, I think about when we're looking at questions that are about the lived experience, and we're looking into an exploration of a phenomenon where we're trying to understand something that's happening in our world to either develop a theory or to test a theory. And it's going to be situated in a larger body of knowledge and literature. And then that's how I see what research is, where maybe assessment is not quite as wide in that context. Often it can be about quality initiatives in our own institutions to help us measure and test how are we doing in a particular area versus maybe really trying to understand something that's a bit broader, which would fall into empirical research. Can assessment and program evaluation become research questions? Absolutely. And that'll come back to what our intention is with our question and the purpose for why we're gathering this data and what we plan to do with it.
Thanks, Shaylee and Lori. I'll just add one point to that just maybe bookends it in addition to what you said and the emphasis on the question and Lori's definition. Some of the confusion originated many years ago when people saw a distinction between evaluation and research. And it was largely framed from a positivist paradigm, where people thought that scientific experiment was the gold standard for quantitative methods, which fit well with the positives. We've long moved from that. And the reason that they thought that you couldn't have evaluation because there was no generalizability. So since then, we've had other theorists come out, Michael Patton, for instance, a pragmatist, and he really thought that, and he's a real advocate for qualitative research. And he talks a lot about exactly what Shaylu and Lori said, and that really, I think he says that judging accomplishments and effectiveness is what evaluation is about. But when this process is conducted systematically with rigor, so that rigor part in data collection analysis, it becomes what he calls evaluation research. So that's that kind of in between that Lori and Shaylu were both referring to. So moving on from that, we're going to kind of follow along that line because this is part of where people, I think, in institutions get stuck. They go to do some assessment or evaluation of a program or service, and then they've got, it's usually a surveys, but let's park that for a moment. And they realize, oh, we have a research ethics board at our institution, and they vet all research proposals that involve human subjects. So now I've got this, and I'm going to be involving human subjects. Obviously, I'm going to be asking questions. Do I need to take it to research ethics? So there's confusion there, what goes and what doesn't go. And I know it's probably unique to institutions, but maybe both Lori and Shaylu can comment on that because it also helps us understand the pros and cons of doing it and where we really are placing some of the work that we're doing. Who would like to start? Shaylu?
Sure. Well, I'm going to put out here that I have a bias. I have 6 years now on the Human Research Ethics Board at UVic. So I think that they would be very upset with me if I didn't say I'm a very strong advocate, and applying that sort of lens to assessment work, unless the assessment is solely about quality initiatives. So that's where maybe it's a very internally focused set of questions that we're not doing anything beyond trying to understand a satisfaction or perspective that our users have with a particular service or a resource that we are offering. And that data and information isn't going anywhere else other than to inform our own policy review or a practice review. But ultimately, I think the research ethics process, if anything we're asking will take us beyond that, then it's definitely worth doing, because the forms themselves, although they can be daunting from institution to institution, and I'll be really frank with you, UVic Human Research Ethics is really tough. Like, we'll have applicants that have had approval from other institutions, like they're co-collaborating researchers, like say U of T, and it's been approved, and then UVic will see it and we'll go, oh, please change this, please look at this. But it's an important vetting process to look at the way in which we ethically approach research, right from how we recruit our participants, what power relationships there might be, clarity even around identifying the techniques for data collection, storage, what we're going to do with that, privacy issues, confidentiality, anonymity, and it's really with the objective of ensuring that the research is done ethically and respectful of human subjects, and also to mitigate risk to the researcher and to the institution. So I find it's really an important form to do on that level, but it's also a really great way to organize your project, because the way it's broken down really helps you as a researcher, helps me to identify all the pieces I really need to think about up front before I even initiate the data gathering, and recognizing the consent that I need to have in place so that my research participants understand what my intention is, what I'm going to do with their information in a very transparent way. And the one thing to keep in mind is human research ethics boards don't comment on methods and methodology or your research question. They're really there to look at the process and to see that there's respect and the welfare of participants are taken care of.
Lori, do you have anything to add?
Well, I don't have much to add because I definitely agree with everything that Shailu has said. I work at an institution where, yeah, the default would always be to apply for ethics for any kind of project where there's data collection happening with human participants. And I also am always of the opinion that you should, at the very least, err on the side of caution and speak with your research ethics boards, you know, the officer or that group, to find out what the steps are. But my advice, no matter what institution someone is working at, is always to request to go through that process, unless there's a very good reason that the board itself gives you that you don't need to, or that you're exempt, rather than taking the stance of, what can I do to avoid research ethics. I think that's the wrong, I don't like that route to take, to try to avoid or find a way around it, because even though it might seem like a lot of steps, and it is in fact a lot of steps, one of my hats that I wear at work is planning, and I also teach when I do workshops. One of the workshops I used to do a lot was on planning research studies, and I really think that it's, it is the most important step, and it's one of those things that takes a lot of time, but in the end, of course, saves you not just time, but a lot of pain and struggle. So as Shailu has said, that process, while cumbersome, is necessary, but it also is very beneficial because it forces the researcher or the research team to plan out the methods, the steps, and everything in advance, to really think about, what am I going to be doing? Who am I going to be interacting with? What are the possible harms that could occur, and how can I mitigate this? Because you really want to take that, harm reduction approach from the very beginning. So another thing I'd like to add, and this is not the same thing as the research ethics application process, but something to think about when we think about ethical research, is who are we doing research on? Who is being who is given a voice in this research, and who is maybe not going to get a voice, either intentionally or unintentionally. So there's harm on an individual level, but I think it's important as people who are conducting assessments, evaluations, or research projects to think about the populations and the people that will be invited or accidentally omitted from being heard in our reports, in our evaluations, and the impact that has over time in our institutions and in librarian information practice.
Great, thank you. And we all have seen examples of individuals who, perhaps not even in the library, who have gleefully thought that, oh, they're just doing a program evaluation, they can escape taking this to the research ethics board. And in the end, we're really disappointed when they had really good findings and probably had all the rigor they would have needed to get through a research ethics application, but just didn't pursue it, and then wanted to publish and do some other things. And it was a problem at their institution. So good advice. Thank you both for that. Let's shift back to the beginning. We're going to go back, and Shailu alluded to this before when she was answering the first question. But focus on where it all starts, because I've heard both of you mention, as we've been talking on our different assessment committees and different places, both I work with Shailu and Lori on different parts of assessment that Carl has different projects working. And the notion of the question, the importance of what question are we trying to answer when we conduct assessments, evaluation, or research, and the formulation of the question and that importance and how even a single word or phrase can change your methodology or methods. Do you want to just talk a bit about the importance of the question, Shailu?
Sure. Yeah, I think that when I think of what it is that we're asking or what I would like to ask, I think about what my epistemology is too. So how I frame my own understanding or beliefs around my epistemological orientation of how knowledge is constructed, that it will also guide what it is that I'm asking. So for me, it kind of goes hand in hand in that the question is going to stem from what are my own personal beliefs in how knowledge is constructed, will frame what I ask, and then frame how I'm going to approach it in terms of the methodology that I use. So for me, it has spent a lot of time figuring out that I know that there's a place for quantitative research in some of the questions that we need to ask. And then other questions that I want to ask around the lived experience that our users have or our students have with our organization or particular aspects around it, then I'm going to start thinking about the fact that my own paradigm of understanding with qualitative inquiry and epistemology is going to fall more in the subjectivist, interpretivist lens to things. So I know that my intention with my questions are very rarely to generalize when it comes from me as a personal researcher, that I'm not necessarily doing research that my organization or institution has asked me to do, but that I'm investigating. And with that in mind, the question will be framed in ways that are more about that lived experience that my users may have. So an example of I know we're going to talk a little bit more about specific examples around studies, but I'll just put this out there and then pass it to Lori. So I see that we're almost at like noon, noon Pacific time. Where does the time go? But I did a photo narrative study a few years ago, and I was looking at how our students experience space and had them take photos of that. And within that was recognition that sometimes photos can be used as quantitative, seen as the somehow objective evidence, yet they are subjective too in terms of how we present things, what lens I'm looking at, my own identity as the person taking that image, my identity as someone who's sitting with the student to understand why this photo, what is it about this image that they took and what are they trying to express to me, all stems from identity. And that identity comes back to my own epistemology, and understanding that piece has been incredibly foundational to what questions that I ask, and then how I will move through my research in terms of methodology, through the theories that I'm going to apply to understanding that data, and how I then present that data.
Lori.
Well, thank you, Shailu. Couldn't agree more with all of what you said. I think the only thing that I maybe could add, which would expand on that, would be when I'm thinking about the question or working with the team, it's really trying to articulate what we're hoping to, what problem we're hoping to solve. And I mean that the sense of the problem in even in the research sense of like, what is the problem and what is the answer going to look like? So not what I think the findings are going to be, but what am I looking to find? And that's what do I really want to know? And so asking that question is asking a clear question is important, and it's an iterative process. It's ongoing. It can evolve a bit. It can even evolve, especially in qualitative emergent design. And I think that it's clear that the question is going to help determine, if not direct, it's going to help determine the methodological approach and certainly the choice of methods. But the question is going to be answered by the results. So if you have an idea of what you want to answer, it will help you phrase your question, because often we have really interesting research results, but they don't always line up with an original research question. And I think the same thing can happen in evaluation and assessment projects, where we get very interesting data and even interesting findings, and they're answering other questions. And it's not the terrible thing, but sometimes you have way too much data, or you have slightly different answer, and you might not be sure what to do with that information. And so I think that comes sometimes from having a very broad question or a vague question that you think you understand what it means, but then you collect a bunch of data and you're actually answering a slightly different question, and that can arise from several issues along the way. And so just reiterating the importance of being really clear on what you want to find, which then ties into your epistemology in terms of what do you think about knowledge? Like, what are you hoping to find? What is the truth that you're looking for? Is it some kind of, is it some kind of numerical, quantitative, factual, absolute, or is it a value judgment? Is it understanding lived experience, and so on?
Great. Okay. I have a follow-up, and I'm going to save it to later because we have about 10 minutes left, and I'll see if I'll follow up because I want you to connect your question to planning your program of assessment when you plan a new program. So know that that's coming. So let me just move on. We talked about, you both mentioned, particularly I've heard Lori talk about methods and methodologies and the importance of distinguishing them in some of our discussions. Lori, why don't you start us off and just talk about, the selection of methods for any given methodology and how you distinguish that. And you already mentioned giving voice and the importance of those selections and talking about privilege and voice to certain populations. So if you want to build that in again, we can't emphasize that enough.
Sure. So I think I'll start, Mary Jo, with my own maybe just sort of simplified way of distinguishing methodology from methods. And I think that's an easy kind of clue, and some people really have their own way of just making these distinctions, but I think of methods in the plural, and that makes it easier than saying method. Methods are a set of instruments or a set of tools. It's the protocol of your research project or your assessment project. It is the steps you take. It is not a singular thing. It is a combination in your toolkit for your particular project that you select, and it can be kind of mixed and matched. Can have multiple different aspects to your methods, in contrast to the methodology, which is to me is a methodological approach. And so it's the approach that you're taking to answer your research question. So building on what Shailu said, you have your epistemology, and your research question is phrased in a way that follows that, and then the methodology will be in concert with that. And so sometimes we talk about quantitative methodology or qualitative methodologies or approaches. I like to think of things, I like to use different terms than qualitative and quantitative, but you could think of an interpretivist approach, or what it was, I think, up until recently referred to as naturalistic inquiry. So these are just more general approaches or methodologies. It's sort of the justification or the rationale for how you're going to approach answering the question. And then the actual steps that you take, the particular protocol, the step-by-step are your methods, and that could be your sampling or your sampling frame, your data collection or data making method, your analysis method or methods, and so forth. So all of those together, and you can have multiple data collection methods and multiple types of analysis. All of those combined make up your methods. So that's like your little recipe to do your project, your evaluation project, or your research project. So that would be the way that I distinguish between the two of them. I'm not sure if there was another part to your question, Mary Jo, so I'll just stop.
Maybe we'll let Shailu answer, and then you could both come back to kind of the importance of selecting, again, talking about privilege and giving voice and how that plays into this. Okay, Shailu.
Yeah, Laurie's definitions between the two are really great and very clear. Perhaps the only thing I'd add is that with methodology, it's just to describe also the theory of how the inquiry is going to proceed. So it involves that analysis of the principles and procedures and that we're actually applying, where the method really is about the tool. And so the methodology does come back to explaining, it requires us to explore and know our epistemological assumptions and what those assumptions are around our beliefs to how knowledge is constructed and that's embedded in a methodological approach. So an example, I'll just give an example, like we all have heard about ethnography. So ethnography can be a research methodology and it's informed by a theoretical framework. So for example, I might use critical theory as my lens and my critical framework within an ethnographic study, but libraries often use ethnographic approaches or ethnography as a method, such as participant observation, so that as a tool, as a method, can be embedded in a particular study, but it does not necessarily mean that the study is actually embedded within an ethnographic methodological approach. So I hope that makes sense, like as a way to sort of distinguish using that example. But other than that, I think that Lori's covered it all.
I think one thing that can trip people up a little bit is, in particular, in journal articles that describe research, in particular that take more quantitative approaches, there is not always, there's infrequently a description of the methodology. It often goes right into the methods. That I think it's not necessarily the same in a description of qualitative research, and it depends on the journal too. But it might be that if you're reading a lot of journal literature, and depending on the types of reports or conference presentations you're hearing about the methods, and you're not necessarily hearing about the methodology, because as Shailu described, there's a lot more work that goes into describing that. But if you're reading someone's doctoral dissertation, there will definitely be an in-depth description of the methodology, in particular in approaches that are less from a post-positive stance and not quantitative, because there is more of a people are going to spend more time justifying that and explaining the theory behind their approach. So I think that's how some people can be confused, because sometimes those words are used interchangeably because they are so similar, and because in some journals there's just a section called methods, and there's the description of the methods, but sometimes the methodology will be kind of snuck in there without very much detail, just kind of mentioned, which isn't super helpful. So I think I can completely understand why it always comes up.
And just so before we get to the last question, we'll move along quickly. I just want to just paraphrase and sum up everything that you're talking about. You're talking a lot of it about in the research context, in the context of conducting research, but it all applies to evaluation and assessment. It's just putting more rigor behind some of the processes that we go through as we think about these different aspects, right? So that's why we're talking about it today. So we're thinking about an assessment and evaluation with a little bit more behind them than we typically do. So our final question, whether we talking about research or wherever we are in this continuum, we think a lot about qualitative methodologies that lend themselves to qualitative methods that lend themselves to qualitative methods. Do you want to talk a little bit about qualitative methodology? Well, we probably don't have time to in-depth on qualitative methodology, but let's just talk a bit about qualitative methods and how they might fit, and how you want to give some examples of things that particular that we might be able to use in the area of not evaluation and assessment, not just research. Okay. Who wants to start? Lori?
Sure. Yeah, this is always it's an interesting topic, and I'm a big fan of qualitative approaches, both in research and in assessment or evaluation, in academic librarianship and other areas. I think that, like, it's interesting because I've done projects that I think could be considered evaluation projects that I've published as research studies. I've done a randomized control trial, but I've also done qualitative, what would be considered a qualitative approach. I prefer the term interpretive approach, because I think qualitative, to me, that's the type of data I'm working with. And then the tools that I'm using with that are within, like, interpretive or naturalistic inquiry, and what we typically associate with qualitative research. So an example would be and this is actually a study that was published, but I was interested with some colleagues, my colleagues Megan Fitzgibbons and Andrea Miller-Nesbitt, investigating the usefulness of journal clubs in academic libraries. And we used a purely evaluative approach. It was taken from It's Lincoln and Guba's 4th generation evaluation. This is an excellent text on really doing rigorous evaluation, but realistic evaluation of programs, but looking at it from a larger than one institution, a perspective of more than one institution, but rather looking at different individuals engaged in journal clubs and seeing the impact of those. And so I think that, so we're taking a qualitative evaluation approach, applying it in this case in librarianship, but not to a library service, but rather to a professional development, arguably a professional development activity. But we were really open to what are the outcomes of this activity? Is it professional development even? And taking that, I think it allowed us to, it was an exploratory, it allowed us to get a lot of data and look at it kind of broadly and really prioritize the voices of the people that we were speaking to, rather than prioritizing, for instance, the institution or the administrators or even the investigators, the researchers. So I think that's an example of one of the benefits of doing that kind of research. And I'll stop with that example, but I'm sure I have more.
Jay-Lu, do you want to add some comments and examples?
Sure. I guess I come back to that photo narrative study, and that, it also connects to the question about voice. So one of the things I didn't expect to find, so my question was really a few years ago, because we were looking at library space, thinking about renovations in the future. And I was curious around how students create and recreate their own learning space within the library, and why, and what's happening there that's allowing them to create the spaces they need. So to take photos of how they're doing that. And what I found as a sort of finding I didn't expect was a number of international students participated in the study in numbers that we'd never seen in other types, like surveys or focus groups, usability studies. And what I've discovered from that, talking to the students, were the pressure was off of them to have the right words, to have the language, especially if English was an additional language. But the photograph became this more universal way in which to engage with me. And it helped balance off some of that power dynamic between researcher and the participant, because we had this intermediary piece of the photo. And what photos they chose to take was within their control, within this large question, but really they were more of that guide and that participant of this research. And it helped to sort of equal off that power dynamic within that study. And I'm going to shamelessly plug the book, because there's lots of studies in here of how libraries and library professors have used visual. And I think that's a place within libraries. We tend to favor the oral, we tend to favor the survey, the focus groups. But exploring different ways of investigating the same types of questions that we've been asking for years can lead us to different understanding of our users and how they're using the libraries, or how we're contributing to larger knowledge constructions. What I tend to also come at my research from a critical theoretical lens. So I'm looking for that power issue. So even in my PhD and then work subsequent to my PhD around leadership, I'm looking at critical theories, critical feminism, critical race theory, to understand what my data is telling me. And that also will frame what it is that I end up choosing to study, because I'm all about identity, and I think that we can't easily separate our identities from what it is that we ask, right from the question, right through to the methodology and our interpretation. And as qualitative researchers, triangulating our data, talking about our positionality through our own statements of who we are, what we're bringing to this, and being very clear about the strengths and limitations of the methodology that we're using, or the theories that we're using, and what lenses that we're using, is incredibly important. It takes it out of the intuition, takes it out of the professional judgment, and frames it in a stronger place, our research and our data and our findings.
Thank you. I think we're at about time. We have about 15 minutes left for questions thereabouts. And so if anybody has questions, if they could put them in the Q&A box, we will try to address them. I'll watch for them as they pop up. But in the meantime, not to waste any minutes, I have a question that a couple questions that I've been saving. It's kind of following up from this last topic, and you know, you both talked about both the evaluation that you've done or other research. Do you think that there's more opportunity for libraries to engage in a wider range of methods and do things relative to assessment and evaluation if we think a lot more? I know it needs to be questioned, but do you think there's more help and more thought needed in formulating questions and doing this work so that we can look at more qualitative? I know, Laura, you don't like necessarily the word qualitative, but just so that we're kind of focusing on something, I shouldn't even pick qualitative. I guess what I'm trying to say is that I think that quite often we default to the same old, we'll do a survey, which could end up quantitative or qualitative. We'll do a focus group, and we don't explore the breadth of some of the kinds of things that you've talked about. So can you both maybe comment on that? I don't see any other questions popping up, so maybe we've got a little bit of time.
I'm happy to pipe in. I just want to clarify. I love the word qualitative. I love it. It's just, I find it's like methodology and method. I think it's used to doing different things, and so it can be confounding and be confusing what we're talking about. So sometimes I'll use a different word just to clarify. Yeah, I think that it would be, you know, I think we can always be using different methods, not just for the sake of using alternative methods or approaches. But I think, again, coming back to, you know, Shailu's point about the question, you know, being so central is really starting with the question and not starting with a method, and not assuming it's going to be a survey, and not assuming that a focus group is going to get the answers that we need. Is a focus group just a fancy way of doing a consultation? You know, so this is like the difference between evaluation and research. Like, are you doing a consultation and calling it a focus group? I don't know, but what is underlying your choice in that method? So really thinking about, like, what is your methodological approach and why? There's an excellent paper that I want to recommend, which is in the publication In the Library with a Lead Pipe. The title is Ditch the Survey. It's #DitchTheSurvey, one word. I'll read you the rest of the title: Expanding Methodological Diversity in LIS Research. It's a required reading in the course I was teaching, because I really, like, from the get-go, I wanted the students in information studies just to know that you know, the default shouldn't be survey methods. And Mary Jo, you point out, like, interviews and focus groups. Also, we tend to just use a very small toolbox, and that toolbox it really could be much, much bigger. And Shailu's book, I think, is a great starting point of just thinking really broadly, and also just looking at all the evaluation and assessment work that's being done out there, and the variety of tools available, including multiple methods or mixed methods, to get at some really interesting questions.
Agreed. That's a great resource in all of that article. And I think it's also part of coming back to always the question, what are we actually asking? And what should we be asking? What are we curious and interested in knowing about? And sometimes it means going back to the literature, going back to library and information science literature, going back to higher ed, and looking at what's being asked, and where are those peaks and the valleys in the research, and where are those gaps that we want to know more about, and starting by broadening out what are the questions that we're actually investigating.
We have a question in the question box, and it's I became a member of the Canadian Evaluation Society a few years ago and found there are not many librarians involved or know of that group, and I wondered why. Any insights? Thoughts? I think it's interesting because Shailu today was talking about providing some examples, and Lori as well, from outside of library as they were providing examples. So, I mean, it kind of speaks to that question that there probably should be more.
Yeah, I've heard of that as organization, and I would have to take a guess. I'm not a member, and I would assume that would be more focused on pedagogical assessment, but I could be wrong. I know there's assessment that takes place across higher education, and certainly in the United States, it's a huge trend, as we've seen at library assessment conferences, the effect that it has. And I think it might be just organizational or association fatigue or just depletion of funds and how much time we have to give to service and other organizations. And I think we do end up prioritizing library organizations and associations first, especially in our own country, and then moving on. And so I think at that point, that would be, but that's my guess of an answer. I guess you'd have to systematically ask more people to get an answer to that. But I would be curious to know how useful it is and how, what tools are being made available or being discussed, what kind of work is being shared, because I think that could be, it sounds like it could be of interest.
Shaylu, do you have anything you want to add?
No, I'm also not a member, and to be honest, I didn't know about the group either. So I think as Laurie was suggesting, that maybe it's an opportunity to talk a little bit more about what their purpose, their mandate is, and what's available that could be supportive to our organizations.
Great. I was going to ask you a question a little while ago when we were talking about formulating the question and thinking about what we wanted to ask. Both of you have components of library, either programs or facilities or different elements. And when you're developing something new, is that the point when you start thinking about the ultimate assessment or evaluation that you might want to do and thinking about the questions you might want to ask, or at what point do you bring that in?
I was going to let you go first, Shaylu, but I would just say, well, we didn't bring up the term, but when I think about assessment, I also think about needs assessment. So there's not just the how we're going to assess it at the end, but also what, when you are implementing a new service or facility or product, there's a needs assessment that hopefully is informing the decision, but even then might need to be updated to kind of inform the service that you're developing, that you're designing, and the service offer that you're going to make. But certainly, like if you're going to be making, in our organization, we have changes, like change requests that we document and we try to keep track of. And in some cases, we look at that and we decide, like, at what point in time are we going to assess this? Like, are we going to do an assessment to see what the outcome was, or if it was effective, or if we need to make further changes or reverse this decision? Is that going to be necessary? So I think it's something that needs to be considered. I'm sure there's exceptions, but always does. But I would also just say that needs assessment can take place right at the beginning, and should precede any decisions, particularly when there is evidence available to be gathered or already created that you can use.
Sometimes, often those new services or programs are based on some prior assessment or a needs assessment that was done prior, and that's what we're trying to address by adding this to identify the gap earlier. And as Laurie was saying, then continuing that assessment throughout, like if you're piloting something and midterms, or to check in and seeing if we are achieving the outcomes that we intended with that service or program. And going beyond asking for the satisfaction piece, and maybe investigating more in terms of what has been the impact of this service or resource to, say, the student learning or the student engagement.
I think I was going to say that I think we maybe sometimes think about, I borrow it from marketing, that notion of a continuous cycle of assessment where you start with the needs assessment and then you move through and evaluate and or assess it at some point, which might take you right back to a secondary needs assessment as you go through that cycle. In any case, we had a comment in chat that noted that the Canadian Evaluation Society has a broad subscription, and they'd started in healthcare but evolved and offer some great training and processes. So thank you for that comment, Ron. We have another question in chat that says, what do you think about the creation of user experience librarian positions in the context of assessment? Oh, you've got to come to one of our future webinars for sure. Okay, and either of you want to answer that?
Well, I could start with that. It's still fairly new at UVic. We have a librarian just within the last sort of 18 months in that role. And I think it's a real great strength in terms of really focusing on an aspect of assessment. So I think of it's interesting, these terms are getting confusing, right? assessment, program evaluation, empirical research. Now we have user experience on that end. And where does user experience fit into that continuum? Or is it actually yet just another, not just another, but another method within some of these larger frameworks? Or is it a whole, is it something on its own? So I guess I don't know enough other than to think that it is probably another method within, and it can be used, again, in empirical research. It can be used as a tool within program evaluation. It can also be used as a form of assessment. Now, I could totally have that wrong, and user experience librarians are free to correct me.
Lori, did you want to jump in?
I couldn't agree more. Yeah, that question it's difficult to answer because, like, what do we think about it? In terms of, like, if, you know, user experience can mean a lot of different things. And so I think it's important, like, what do you want to know? So I agree everything that Shaylee said. I think it is a technique and a toolbox. But I would definitely love to have a discussion with someone who wanted to talk about it perhaps as a methodological approach or as part of or similar to a methodology. But in terms of library assessment, it's just, is it a more narrow part of assessment, and that's why that particular position's being created? Is it to connote a particular approach the library wants to take towards its assessment, like using this method and prioritizing it? And does it signifying some kind of, you know, value placed on user experience as opposed to calling it something else? I'm curious. I'm genuinely curious to know, because I think there may be some things underlying those decisions, and to make those clear and explicit to explain that, I think would be helpful, because, and it would be helpful for people in those positions to understand, like, what are the questions I'm supposed to be answering? Like, what is this role supposed to be? What problems am I supposed to be solving? And so it all comes back to what do you want to do? What do you want to know? And is this the way you want to go about doing it? And if having that more perhaps narrow approach actually helps you to make sure that you always have that user experience focus, then I think it can be beneficial. So I don't have an overall kind of opinion about it, except that I would love to know more about all those positions and the thinking behind them.
I guess I would jump in and just add one thing. I think UX to me is like the word qualitative to you, and I don't mean that in any pejorative way. I just mean that I think that it's one of those words that means different things to different groups of people. And if you're working in UX in Silicon Valley, that means something really different. It's a profession unto itself that starts from trying to identify user needs that users don't necessarily know they have, and move through that process. And it's something different to us, where we might even talk about it as a method. So I think it can be a lot of things. And I think it'll be really interesting to explore this further, because we planned a whole webinar mini series connected to this. This is the first of our continuing education and assessment and on UX. So stay tuned.
It's a good segue.
I think we're pretty much at time. We've got maybe a minute left for Julie to conclude.
All right, so if there are no further questions or comments, on behalf of Carl, I'd like to thank Mary Jo, Lori, and Shaylu for leading this great discussion, and all of our participants for attending. The recording should be available shortly, and again, we ask that you keep an eye out for upcoming webinars in this series. Have a great weekend. Bonne fin de semaine, tout le monde.
Bye.